The door to the abandoned schoolhouse swung open with a shriek of rusted hinges, and Letitia Keene stood in the threshold with her single battered trunk at her feet and her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her teeth. Daniel Whitaker stood inside, one hand braced against the freshly repaired doorframe, his jaw tight, his dark eyes unreadable, and the silence between them was not the silence of strangers. It was the silence of a secret finally, violently surfaced. "You knew," she said. Her voice did not shake, though everything inside her was shaking. "You knew who I was before I ever stepped off that stagecoach." The whole town of Caldera Springs was behind her. She could feel them. Maybelle Hooper from the dry goods store with flour still on her apron. Sheriff Cord Pratt with his thumbs hooked in his belt. Old Jerome Fitch, who had lived in this valley since before the war and had strong opinions about everything. They had all followed her up the hill. They had been waiting all winter for this moment, the moment that would explain why a quiet, solitary man like Daniel Whitaker had ridden into their dying little town the previous October, paid hard cash for the most worthless piece of property in the county, and then spent 4 months fixing it in silence. He had replaced the floor. He had rechinked the log walls. He had built new benches. He had repaired the pot-bellied stove and the chimney and the 2-pane windows. He had painted the small blackboard that had survived 15 years of abandonment. He had done every bit of it alone, working from first light until the stars appeared, and he had not explained himself to a single soul. And now spring had arrived, and so had she, and Daniel Whitaker's dark secret was standing on his doorstep with a trunk full of primer books and a letter of employment issued by the Territorial Board of Education. "I asked them to send you here," he said, and his voice was low and careful, the voice of a man who had rehearsed this moment 100 times and found no version of it that did not require immense courage. "I wrote to the board 8 months ago. I requested a teacher. I described the school. I told them what the children in this valley needed." He paused. "I did not know they would send you." Letitia stared at him. The secret she had carried across 3 territories felt suddenly heavier than her trunk. "Then how did you know my name before I introduced myself?" The town waited. The wind moved through the spring grass on the hillside. A meadowlark called somewhere above the tree line. Daniel Whitaker looked at her with those dark, unreadable eyes and said the words that changed everything between them. "Because your brother told me your name, before he died." The world narrowed to a single point. Thomas. Thomas had known this man. Thomas, who had died in the winter of 1881 on a trail somewhere in the territory of New Mexico, alone and far from home, who had sent her one last letter that she had read until the paper was soft as cloth. Thomas, who had written, "There is a man out here I trust with my life, Letitia. If something happens to me, find Daniel Whitaker. He will make sure you are all right." She had not gone looking for Daniel Whitaker. She had filed the letter away in the darkest corner of her grief and taken a teaching position in Santa Fe, and then another in Tucson, moving always westward, always away from the hollow space Thomas had left in her life, until the Territorial Board of Education had offered her a permanent post in a small town called Caldera Springs, in a newly restored schoolhouse, and she had accepted because she was tired of running. She had not known, until this morning when the stagecoach driver called out the name of the town, and she stepped down and saw Daniel Whitaker's face, that she had not been running away from anything. She had been running toward this. She had recognized him from the daguerreotype in Thomas's last letter. The man in the doorway and the man in the photograph were the same, older by the evidence of a harder winter in his eyes, broader in the shoulders perhaps, but unmistakably the same. "You could have told me," she said. "You could have written." "I did not know how." He ran a hand over the back of his neck, a gesture so purely human in the middle of all this tension that something in her chest cracked open just slightly. "I was not sure you would come if you knew the connection. I was not sure you would want the reminder." Maybelle Hooper behind her muttered something under her breath. Sheriff Pratt cleared his throat. Jerome Fitch said, perfectly audibly, "Well, I'll be hanged." Letitia Keene picked up her trunk by its worn leather handle and walked through the door of the schoolhouse that Daniel Whitaker had built for her without her knowledge, and she did not look back at the town watching from the hillside. She looked at the clean-swept floor, the painted blackboard, the benches built to the right height for children's legs, the small desk at the front of the room positioned precisely to catch the morning light from the east-facing window. She looked at all the work a man had done in silence for a reason he had not been able to say out loud. She set her trunk down next to the desk and said, "You had better tell me everything about my brother's death, and then you had better tell me everything about this town, because I am staying." That was the moment Caldera Springs stopped wondering why Daniel Whitaker had bought the abandoned schoolhouse. They started wondering something else entirely. The story of how Daniel Whitaker came to that valley in October of 1882 began, as so many stories in the West did, with a debt that had nothing to do with money. He had ridden into the New Mexico Territory in the winter of 1880 as a man of 31 with a civil engineer's education from the University of Virginia, a surveying kit, and a contract with the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railway. He was not running from anything specific. He was simply a man who had found that the wide open spaces of the frontier suited his particular brand of solitude better than the crowded drawing rooms of his Virginia upbringing. His family had money. He had chosen not to use it. This was a distinction that mystified everyone who knew him, and a decision he had never regretted. He had met Thomas Keene on the trail between Las Cruces and Silver City in November of 1880, in weather cold enough to kill a man who did not have shelter, and Thomas Keene had not had shelter. His horse had thrown him 2 miles back. His gear was scattered across a ravine. He was sitting on a rock in the last of the afternoon light looking at the sky with the particular expression of a man making his peace with a bad situation. Daniel had not ridden past. He was not a man who rode past people in trouble. He had given Thomas his blanket and half his provisions and helped him rebuild his camp. And in the morning, Thomas had offered to share his coffee, and they had talked for 6 hours straight. The way you talk to a stranger in the wilderness when the cold has stripped away all the usual politenesses, and you are both just two human beings against the immensity of the land. Thomas Keene was 28 years old, educated, funny, possessed of an uncanny ability to read the land, and employed as a contract scout for the U.S. Army. He was also, Daniel learned over the course of that long, cold morning, completely consumed by worry about his younger sister. "Letitia," he had said, pouring a second cup of coffee, "she is the best person I know. She should not be teaching in a frontier town alone. I should be closer, but the Army keeps sending me further out." Daniel had asked what she was like, and Thomas had talked for an hour. Letitia, who had learned to read at 4 years old and had never stopped. Letitia, who argued with the Episcopal minister in Santa Fe about theology and won. Letitia, who could identify 40 species of wildflower, but could not cook anything more complicated than beans and cornbread. Letitia, who had come west after their parents died, and had built a life from scratch through sheer force of will and a teaching certificate. By the time Thomas Keene pulled out the daguerreotype to show him, Daniel Whitaker had already understood with a certainty that made no rational sense that this woman, whoever she was someone worth knowing. He had looked at the photograph for longer than was strictly necessary. A young woman in a dark dress, dark hair pulled back, eyes that even in the flat gray light of daguerreotype managed to look as though they were thinking something interesting. Thomas had laughed. "She has that effect on people," he said. Even in a photograph. They had parted ways that afternoon. They had met again 3 more times over the following year, always by the accident of shared trail, and each time Thomas had talked about his sister with the same fierce devotion. The third time they met, in December of 1881, Thomas had been sick. Sick in a way that both of them recognized but neither named out loud. Fever. A cough that had settled deep. Daniel had stayed with him for 2 weeks at a trading post outside of Mesilla, making sure he was fed and warm, arguing with him about resting. On the 14th day, Thomas had pressed the daguerreotype into Daniel's hand. "I am going to be fine," he said firmly, which meant he knew he was not. "But just in case. Her name is Letitia Keene. She is in Tucson now. If something happens, just make sure she is all right," Daniel had promised. 2 weeks later, word reached him on the trail that Thomas Keene had died at the post in Mesilla. Pneumonia, said the Army report. Alone, it did not say, but Daniel had read it there anyway. He had carried the guilt of not staying longer with him through the spring and summer of 1882, working his survey contracts, watching the railway push further into the territory, building towns out of nothing by the geometry of its tracks. He had watched several of those towns struggle with the same problem: not enough teachers, children growing up wild and illiterate, communities that could not hold together without the civilizing anchor of a school. He had thought about Letitia Keene every time he saw a schoolhouse. He had thought about his promise to Thomas. In September of 1882, he had ridden through Caldera Springs on his way to survey a possible rail spur through the valley. The town was shrinking, like so many small ranching communities. The silver mine 3 miles north had played out. The older families were leaving. The younger ones stayed because they had nowhere else to go, and because the valley soil was rich and the cattle were healthy. But there were 12 children in the valley with no school and no teacher, the original school having been abandoned 6 years earlier when the last teacher left for San Francisco. Daniel had sat on his horse in front of the old schoolhouse for 20 minutes. He had made a decision that he later described to himself as logical and practical. A man with a civil engineer's training could repair a building. The Territorial Board of Education had a program for placing teachers in underserved communities. The two facts connected. It was a practical solution to a practical problem. He had spent another 3 days telling himself this before he admitted that the decision also had something to do with the photograph in his breast pocket and a promise made to a dying man, and an ache of loneliness that the wide frontier had stopped being big enough to contain. He bought the schoolhouse on a Wednesday in October for the price of $45 and a handshake with the county land office. He paid cash. He moved his gear into the building and began work the following morning. The town watched with the deep, attentive suspicion of a community that has very little entertainment and a great deal of time. Mabel Hooper brought him a pie on the 3rd day and asked him point blank what he was building and why. He had said, "A school," and nothing else, and she had gone away with the dissatisfied expression of a woman whose question had been technically answered but fundamentally evaded. Sheriff Pratt had come by the 2nd week with a more official flavor of curiosity, wanting to know Daniel's business, his origins, his intentions regarding the community. Daniel had answered clearly and without evasion on every point except the most interesting one. He was a civil engineer. He came from Virginia. He intended to restore the schoolhouse and apply to the Territorial Board for a teacher. He planned to stay in the valley and perhaps put his engineering skills to work on the infrastructure the community needed, specifically the irrigation channels that would allow the ranchers to expand their grazing land. Pratt had looked at him with the eyes of a man who could tell when a full answer was hiding inside a partial one, but he had tipped his hat and left. Through October and November, Daniel worked. Through December and January, he worked. The winters in the valley were cold but not brutal, and he kept the pot-bellied stove going while he repaired the floor plank by plank, replacing the boards that had rotted through, sourcing lumber from the sawmill in Pinon Creek 20 miles east. He rebuilt the roof. He rebuilt the benches. He wrote to the Territorial Board in Santa Fe, providing detailed specifications of the school and the community need. He listed the number of school-age children. He described the families. He wrote a careful, precise, professional letter that said everything relevant about the school and nothing whatsoever about himself. He did not write to Letitia Keene directly. He was not sure he had the right. He had a promise from a dead man and a photograph, and a set of feelings he could not categorize with the same precision he applied to survey work. Writing to her directly would have required him to explain all of that, and he had not yet found the words that would make it sound like anything other than the behavior of a man who had made a decision about a woman he had never met, which was both exactly what had happened and impossible to justify to anyone including himself. So he had written to the board, and the board, in its bureaucratic wisdom, had assigned the post of teacher at Caldera Springs Schoolhouse to Miss Letitia Keene of Tucson, Arizona Territory, who had applied for a permanent placement and whose qualifications were excellent and whose references were impeccable. The board had not known, and had not needed to know, that the man who restored the school and the woman they were sending to fill it were connected by anything more than professional necessity. That connection arrived on the morning of March the 14th, 1883, on the twice-weekly stagecoach from Pinyon Creek, in the form of Letitia Keene herself. She was 27 years old. She had dark hair and dark eyes, and the kind of face that was not soft but was deeply alive, every thought visible in the movement of her expression, every emotion present without being performed. She was wearing a gray traveling dress that had been good once, and had survived several hundred miles of stage road with its dignity mostly intact. She was carrying a trunk that was clearly too heavy for one person to manage comfortably, and was managing it anyway. Daniel had been at the stage stop because he was always at the stage stop when the twice-weekly coach came through, ostensibly to collect mail and supplies, actually because it was the only point of contact with the wider world that Caldera Springs offered, and because after 4 months of near solitude, he was human enough to crave the minor stimulation of watching strangers arrive. He had recognized her the instant she stepped off the coach, not because she looked exactly like the photograph, though she did, because of the way she looked at things. She looked at the town with the sharp, evaluating gaze of someone who has learned to assess a new place quickly and honestly, and she did not seem disappointed by what she saw, which suggested either optimism or a very thorough briefing from the territorial board. He had stood very still and felt something that was approximately the simultaneous experience of a door opening and a door closing. The opening was the sensation of this woman being real and present after nearly 2 years of existing only in someone else's stories and a small gray photograph. The closing was the certain knowledge that whatever happened next was not going to be simple. He had walked toward her because the only other option was to walk away, and he had given up on that particular option the day he bought the schoolhouse. "Miss Keene," he had said. She had turned, she had looked at him, and something had moved across her face fast and complex, a recognition she could not immediately explain but could not deny. "You are Daniel Whitaker," she had said. It was not a question. "I am. You know my name." "I do." She had not asked how, not yet. She had looked at him for a long moment with an expression that he was not experienced enough to read accurately, and then said, "Would you be willing to show me the school?" And the whole town had followed them up the hill, and the door had shrieked open, and here they were, now in the clean morning light of the schoolhouse, with the town slowly dispersing back down the hill outside, talking in the low, urgent tones of people who have just witnessed something they will be discussing for months. Letitia sat down on the edge of the teacher's desk and looked at Daniel Whitaker and said, "Tell me." He told her. He told her about the trail between Las Cruces and Silver City. He told her about the cold and the coffee and 6 hours of talking. He told her about Thomas's laugh, which she already knew but which hurt beautifully to hear described by someone else's voice. He told her about the 3 meetings over a year and the fever and the 2 weeks at the trading post. He told her about the photograph and the promise. She listened without speaking. Her hands were folded in her lap and her face was very still in the way that faces become still when they are working extremely hard to contain something enormous. When he finished, she was quiet for a long time. "He did not tell me about you," she said finally, "in any of his letters. He described you, I think, in the last letter, but he did not use your name. He called you a good man on the trail. He said I would know you by your steadiness." She paused. He was right. Daniel felt the weight of the past year shift slightly in his chest, not leaving, but rearranging itself into something more bearable. "I am sorry I did not find a way to tell you before now," he said. "I am sorry I did not look for you when he asked me to." She met his eyes, and there was nothing evasive in her gaze, no deflection, no performance. Just direct, honest grief shared between two people who had loved the same person and been shaped by the same absence. "I was afraid of what you might tell me. I thought if I knew the details of how he died, I would not be able to keep going." "He died quickly," Daniel said. "One morning he was talking and the next he was not. There was no suffering at the end. I need you to know that." She closed her eyes for a moment. "Thank you." The silence that followed was different from the first silence. It was not charged with confrontation. It was the silence of two people who have said the most important things and are now existing in the space after them, adjusting. "The school is beautiful," she said, opening her eyes. "You did all of this yourself." "Most of it. The Ridley brothers helped me with the roof when the snow made it dangerous to work alone." "How many children?" 12, ages 6 through 14. 3 families provide all of them: the Garcias, the Ridleys, and the Fitch family, plus 2 children belonging to Doc Hartley, the town physician. She nodded, already making the calculations of a teacher planning her classroom. "Mixed ages. I have done it before." She looked at the benches, counting. "I will need to reorganize the seating so the younger children are nearer the front. And I will need supplies. Has anyone provided a budget?" "The board sends a quarterly supply box. The first one is due in April. I also placed an order at the Pinyon Creek Mercantile, which should arrive this week. Primer books, slate boards, chalk." She looked at him then with an expression he had not seen before, something complicated and warm and slightly wary all at once. The look of a woman who has received an unexpected kindness from someone she is not yet sure she trusts, with the knowledge that she is moved by it. "You thought of everything," she said. "I tried." "Why?" The word came out direct, undecorated, exactly the kind of question she seemed to ask. "Not the practical reasons, the real reason." He considered evasion. He set it aside. "Because I promised your brother I would make sure you were all right. And because after 2 years of hearing about you from the person who knew you best, I thought that a woman who argued with ministers about theology and could identify 40 wildflowers was someone who deserved a school worth teaching in." She stared at him. A very faint color came into her face. "Thomas told you about the wildflowers." "He told me a great deal." "That is," she said carefully, "both touching and somewhat alarming." "I imagine it is." She stood from the desk, smoothed her dress, and walked to the window that looked out over the valley. The spring grass was coming in green on the hillside. Below, the town's scattered buildings were silver and gold in the morning light, and smoke from the breakfast fires of 3 ranches made thin lines against the blue sky. "I came here to start fresh," she said. "I did not come here to be a project or a promise or a debt a man owed my dead brother." "I know," he said. "I will make that very clear now, because I think it is better to say it than to let it sit underneath everything else and become a problem later." "That is fair." She turned from the window and looked at him steadily. "But I will also be honest. My brother trusted you. He trusted very few people. That means something to me." "It means something to me too," Daniel said. She nodded once, the nod of a woman filing something under important but unresolved. "I should unpack," she said. "Where am I lodging?" "Maybelle Hooper has a spare room. She said to tell you it is ready and that she made up fresh bedding this morning." Maybelle Hooper, who was just outside with flour on her apron. "Yes. She will want to ask me approximately 300 questions. At least." A smile moved across Letitia's face, quick and real, and for a moment she looked exactly the way Thomas had described her, the best person he knew. Daniel felt something shift in his chest again, and this time it did not shift back. The children arrived on a Monday morning 3 days later, 12 of them ranging in age and demeanor from 6-year-old Rosa Garcia, who arrived in a pressed dress and sat up straight with the earnest attention of someone who has been looking forward to school since before she could articulate what school was, to 14-year-old Caleb Ridley, who arrived late and sat in the back, and looked at the blackboard with the profound skepticism of someone who considers formal education a suspicious luxury. Letitia Keene stood at the front of the room and looked at them all and said, "Good morning. I am Miss Keene. I am from Tucson by way of Santa Fe and before that from Ohio, and I have been a teacher for 6 years. I am not easy to fool, and I do not give praise I do not mean, but I do give it when I mean it. We will work hard here. We will also have good days. Any questions?" Rosa Garcia raised her hand immediately and asked whether they would learn to read poetry, and Letitia said yes. Caleb Ridley raised his hand in the back and asked whether attendance was truly mandatory, and Letitia said yes to that too, but in a tone that acknowledged the reasonableness of the question, while leaving no room whatsoever for the answer to be different. Caleb Ridley looked at her with slightly renewed interest. By the end of the first week, Letitia Keene had sorted her students by ability rather than age, had identified which 3 of them were struggling with the basic mechanics of reading, and had begun working with them separately during the afternoon session, and had set Caleb Ridley to tutoring the youngest children in arithmetic, a job which he performed with surprising patience, and which she suspected was the first time in recent memory he had been given a responsibility that made him feel useful rather than supervised. The town's attention to the schoolhouse had not diminished. Every morning, one or more of the adults seemed to find a reason to walk past or stop by. Jerome Fitch, who had strong opinions about education, came to inspect the blackboard and offered his views on the proper teaching of American history, which Letitia received with courteous attention, and then largely disregarded in favor of her own curriculum. Maybelle Hooper brought cookies on Friday afternoon, which Letitia accepted with genuine gratitude because the children loved them. Daniel Whitaker came on the second Wednesday, not during school hours, in the late afternoon when the children had gone home. He came because the wood box was getting low, and he had stacked a new cord behind the schoolhouse in the morning and wanted to make sure she knew it was there and how to work the stove damper if the wind changed direction. These were legitimate practical reasons. They both knew there were other reasons too. He stood in the doorway while she was grading slates at her desk, and she looked up and said, "The third-grade readers the board sent are 4 years out of date. Do you know if there is a way to order newer ones?" And he stepped inside, and they spent 40 minutes discussing education supply logistics in the territory of New Mexico, which was a genuinely useful conversation, and which also had the quality, for both of them, of a conversation about something else entirely. He came again the following week to check a window latch that had been sticking. She was making a set of flashcards from the brown paper the supply box had been wrapped in, and she handed him a pair of scissors without looking up and said, "Cut those strips while you are here." And he cut them for 20 minutes while she dictated letters and numbers, and neither of them thought this was strange. By the end of April, the visits had acquired a shape. 3 or 4 times a week, in the late afternoon, Daniel Whitaker would find a reason to come by the schoolhouse, and Letitia Keene would find something for them to do together. He fixed things. She taught him things. She told him about a student who had written an astonishing composition about the mountains. He told her about the irrigation survey he was working on for the Garcia Ranch, and how the topography of the valley made a gravity-fed channel possible if the landowners could agree on the right-of-way. She asked smart questions about the engineering that surprised him and led to longer explanations and longer evenings at the teacher's desk, with a map spread between them. He asked smart questions about the children that surprised her and revealed a sensitivity to people that she had not expected from a man who had spent 2 years mostly alone. "You are not what I expected," she told him one evening in late April when the light through the east window had gone gold and late and she had not noticed the time passing. "What did you expect?" he asked. "A man fulfilling an obligation, quietly guilty, a little uncomfortable around me." "I am a little uncomfortable around you," he said. She raised an eyebrow. "But not for the reasons you're thinking," he said. "It is not guilt." "What is it then?" He looked at her across the map of the valley, this woman who had been a story for 2 years and was now the most vivid and particular person in his daily life, and said, "I have not figured out the right words for it yet." She held his gaze for a moment, long enough that it was not accidental, not long enough to be a declaration, and said, "When you find them, tell me." May arrived with warmth and wildflowers on the hillside, and Letitia Keene took her students out of the schoolhouse on a Tuesday morning and walked them up through the spring grass and named every flower they found. She knew 40 species. Daniel had told her from Thomas's account, and she counted them off for the children one by one, the scientific name and the common name and the particular detail that made each one worth remembering. Rosa Garcia collected samples in her apron pocket. Caleb Ridley, who had by now completed the transformation from skeptic to unofficial co-teacher, wrote the names down in a notebook he had started keeping without anyone asking him to. Doc Hartley's daughter Miriam, who was 10 and had the focused attention of a natural scientist, asked about the properties of each plant with a specificity that made Letitia's heart lift. Daniel was surveying a hillside 200 yards above when the class came through, and he stopped his work and watched them from the ridge for 20 minutes, 12 children and one woman moving through the spring meadow, and felt something he had no precedent for, a happiness so uncomplicated it was almost disorienting. He came down the hill at the end of the school day and found her sitting on the schoolhouse steps, watching the last of the children disappear down the road. "Your students know 40 species of wildflower," he said. 38. "We ran out of mourning." She looked up at him. "Thomas told you about the flowers. He said you started a wildflower journal when you were 8 years old. I still have it." She looked down the road where the children had gone. "He used to bring me specimens from wherever he was assigned. He pressed them between pages of whatever book he had with him and sent them in his letters." She paused. "The last one he sent was a prickly poppy from somewhere in New Mexico. I did not know which trail he was on when he found it. Now I suppose I can guess. He was on the Las Cruces Road," Daniel said quietly. "There is a stretch about 30 miles south where they come up in November, orange-yellow, almost the color of fire." She closed her eyes briefly. "Yes, that is exactly what it looked like." He sat down on the steps beside her, which was slightly closer than they usually sat, and she did not move away, and the evening light came down over the valley and the meadowlarks called from the pasture below, and the silence was the kind that is full rather than empty. "I think about him," she said, "every day still. It has been a year and a half and I still expect him to walk around a corner somewhere." "Grief is not a thing that follows a schedule," Daniel said. "No." She turned and looked at him. "Did it help you, doing all of this?" She gestured at the schoolhouse behind them. "Building this for him?" He considered the question honestly. "I built it for you," he said, "and for the children who needed it, but yes, it helped." She looked at him for a long moment with that particular expression he had catalogued over the past 2 months, the one that was warm and wary and deeply intelligent all at once, the one that meant she was deciding something. "I am glad you did," she said. "I am glad you are here." He held very still, the way you hold still when something wild and rare has come close enough to touch, and you do not want to frighten it away. "I am glad you are here too," he said. The thing that happened between them after that was not a single moment or a single conversation. It was the accumulation of 100 small moments over the weeks of May, each one leaving a mark that did not fade before the next one arrived. It was Letitia staying late to plan the following week's lessons and Daniel staying, because he had said he would fix the window shutter, but the fixing had taken 5 minutes, and then they had started talking. It was Daniel bringing her coffee in the mornings because Maybelle Hooper made it weak, and Letitia made no complaint about this, but had once described, perfectly, the coffee she had loved at a cafe in Santa Fe. And Daniel had bought good Arbuckle's coffee beans at the Mercantile and ground them to the right coarseness, and arrived at the school before the students one morning with a pot of it. She had taken the first cup and gone perfectly still and said nothing for 30 seconds and then said, "You are deeply unfair," and he had not known whether she meant the coffee or something else. It was the evening in late May when she was reading by the window after the students had gone and the valley was taking on the long blue shadows of dusk, and she said without looking up, "I think I was afraid of you when I arrived." He looked up from the survey notes he had spread on the far end of the desk. "Afraid of what specifically?" "Of what you might make me feel." She turned a page. "I thought you were a complication. I thought Thomas had sent me into a situation designed to make me feel obligated to someone when all I wanted was a fresh start in my own life." That was a reasonable thing to think. It was not entirely wrong. She closed the book and looked at him. "You did complicate everything. I am sorry." "No, you are not." "No," he agreed. "I am not." She laughed. It was the first time he had heard her laugh at something he said, a real laugh, surprised out of her, and it transformed her face completely, and he thought with perfect clarity, "I am going to spend the rest of my life trying to make that happen." The trouble arrived in June in the person of Weston Carr. Carr was a land speculator out of Denver, a man of 42 with a good suit and a persuasive manner, and the particular breed of confidence that comes from having made and lost several fortunes, and having learned that the spaces between fortunes could be bridged by the right kind of pressure on the right kind of people. He arrived in Caldera Springs on a Tuesday with a buckboard and a surveyor's assistant, and the news, delivered first to Sheriff Pratt and then to anyone else within earshot, that the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railway was considering a spur line through the valley. This was not entirely a lie. The railway was indeed considering the spur line. Daniel knew this because he had been employed by the railway 18 months ago to survey it. He also knew that the railway's decision was still pending, and that it depended on land acquisition costs, and that a man like Weston Carr arriving ahead of the official announcement meant one thing. Carr had paid someone inside the railway for advance information, and was here to buy land cheap before the official announcement drove prices up. This was not illegal. It was the kind of thing that happened in the West with depressing regularity. The small communities that had nothing and then, suddenly, had something valuable, and were not always equipped to protect it. Daniel went to Sheriff Pratt the morning after Carr's arrival. He explained what he knew about the railway's plans, what he knew about advanced land speculation, and what he suspected Carr's actual purpose was. Pratt listened with the focused attention of a man whose job is to protect his community and said, "Can you prove it?" "No," Daniel admitted. "Not yet." "Then I cannot stop him from buying land legally offered for sale, but I can keep a close eye on his methods." Daniel went next to the Garcia and Ridley families, the largest landowners in the valley, and told them what he knew. He spoke directly and completely, not managing the information but sharing all of it, including his uncertainty. Rafael Garcia, who was 50 years old and had built his ranch from nothing over 20 years and had seen speculators before, listened and thanked him, and said he would not be selling to anyone without consulting an attorney. Edmund Ridley, who was younger and had 3 young children and a ranch that was barely profitable, was more complicated. His mortgage was overdue. Carr's offer, when it came, would look like a lifeline. Daniel knew this. He spent 3 evenings thinking about it. On the 4th day, he went to Edmund Ridley and offered to help him secure a proper bank loan against the expected increase in land value once the railway decision was announced officially, using Daniel's own engineering credentials to provide the value assessment that the bank would need. This was not a small offer. It meant using his professional reputation as a guarantee for another man's debt. Edmund Ridley looked at him for a long time and said, "Why are you doing this?" "Because your children are in that school," Daniel said, "and because your ranch is worth keeping in your family." Edmund agreed. They rode to the bank in Pinyon Creek together the following week. The loan was approved. Edmund Ridley did not sell to Weston Carr. Carr, finding the major landowners unified and resistant, shifted his attention to the less obvious leverage points in a small community. He spent money at the saloon. He was charming and generous with information about the wider world. He let it be known, carefully and indirectly, that the school was a temporary enterprise depending on continued territorial funding, which was, he implied, uncertain. This reached Letitia on a Thursday afternoon via Maybelle Hooper, who heard it from Jerome Fitch, who had heard it at the saloon, and who was clearly distressed. Maybelle brought it to Letitia along with a pot of soup for her supper, and Letitia received the news with the same still-faced composure she brought to everything unpleasant, and which Daniel had learned meant she was very angry. He found out about it at supper when Letitia appeared at the door of the house he had been renting from the Garcia family, which she had never done before, and said, with precise quiet control, "Tell me whether there is any truth to the claim that the school's funding is uncertain." He stepped back and let her in and told her everything he knew about the funding structure, which was, territorial schools funding was indeed periodically reviewed, but the school at Caldera Springs had been formally established and was supported by the board's permanent placement of a teacher, and there was no current threat to that funding that he was aware of. Then this man is spreading false fears to weaken the community's resistance to his offers, she said. That is my belief, yes. That is despicable. Yes. She sat down in the chair beside the fireplace with the focused expression of a woman solving a problem. What does he actually want? The valley land, cheaply acquired before the railway drives prices up. And the railway is actually coming. I believe so, yes, I did the original survey. The route through this valley is the most efficient by any measure. So the community's land will be genuinely valuable. Very. In 2 or 3 years if the spur is built. She looked at him. Then the community needs to know this officially, not just from you. They need documentation. The railway will not announce officially until the board has voted. Then we need someone who can speak credibly about what the land value will be. You could do that. You have engineering credentials and survey experience. Write a report. Present it to the community officially with Sheriff Pratt present with all the families who have land in this valley. He had been thinking about this. Having her say it clearly and directly clarified it into a plan. If I do that, Carr will know where the information came from. He has railway contacts. He could make trouble for me professionally. She looked at him steadily. Would that trouble be serious? It might close some doors. I have some protection because my reputation is sound, but railway men can be vindictive. Is protecting this community worth that risk to you? The question was asked without any pressure behind it, just cleanly and honestly, wanting to know what he valued and how much. Yes, he said without hesitation. Something moved in her eyes, quick and bright and then carefully managed. Then I will organize the meeting, she said. I have spent 2 months building relationships with every family in this valley. They trust me. You provide the document and the expertise. I will make sure everyone comes and that the context is clear. He looked at her across the firelit room, this woman who had come to this valley to start fresh and was already fighting for it with the same fierce loyalty she gave to everything she cared about, and felt the love he had been not naming for 2 months rise in him with a clarity that was almost painful. You are extraordinary, he said. It was not a planned thing to say. It came out simple and unguarded, the way truth tends to do when you are not watching your own mouth. She went very still for a moment. A color came into her face and she looked down at her hands and then back up at him with an expression that was open in a way he had rarely seen it open. Daniel, she said quietly. Yes. I think you should know something. I am listening. I came here as Thomas asked me to in a way, not because I looked for you, but because I was tired and I needed somewhere to go and the school was a reason and a purpose, and I thought that was all I needed. She paused. I was not looking for anyone. I had decided, I think, that I was not going to fall in love with someone out here because it would complicate my work and my independence, and because the men I had met in frontier towns were almost uniformly not equipped to value a woman who had her own opinions and her own work and her own life. He waited, very still. You are equipped for that, she said. In a way I have not encountered before. You built this school without telling me. You fought for this community without asking for recognition. You cut strips of brown paper for flashcards for 45 minutes without once suggesting that your time was more important than mine. She looked at him directly, all her usual careful management of distance gone. I did not expect you, Daniel. I am trying to tell you that. He crossed the room. He did it because staying still was no longer something he was capable of. He stood in front of her and took her hand, which was the most careful and deliberate physical contact they had ever made, and she looked up at him and did not pull back. I did not expect you either, he said. I expected to fulfill a promise and settle in a community I could be useful to. I did not expect someone who argues with ministers and knows 40 species of wildflowers and organizes community town halls before she has been in a place for 3 months. 38, she said. We ran out of mourning. He laughed. She laughed. Their hands were still linked between them, and neither one reached for the proper social reason to break the contact. I love you, he said. It came out with the same uncalculated clarity as what he had said before. He decided this was the only honest way to say it. I have been trying to find the right words for some time, as you know. Those appear to be the right ones. She looked at him for a long moment. Her hand held his with a grip that was not uncertain. I know, she said. I know you do. And she paused, and he could see her working through the last of her careful distance, making the deliberate choice to set it down. I love you too. It terrifies me a little. Me too. Good, she said. It should. It means it is real. The meeting took place on a Friday evening in the schoolhouse, which was the only building in Caldera Springs large enough to hold all the families and still felt appropriate. Letitia having made it the community's center in 3 months of teaching in the same way that remarkable teachers always do. Every family came. The Garcias, the Ridleys, the Fitches, Doc Hartley, Maybelle Hooper, and Sheriff Pratt, who came in an official capacity and sat at the back with his arms folded and his eyes watchful. Weston Carr did not come, but one of his associates was there, a quiet man named Peel who wrote in a notebook throughout and left before the discussion began. Daniel presented his survey findings in the clear, precise language of a professional engineer. He showed maps. He described the proposed route. He gave his best estimate of the timeline and the likely impact on land values. He was honest about uncertainty where uncertainty existed and clear about fact where fact existed, and the families listened with the attention of people whose livelihoods depended on understanding what they were hearing. When he was done, Rafael Garcia asked the first question about water rights and how the railway construction might affect the irrigation channels. Daniel answered in detail. Edmund Ridley asked about the land acquisition process, whether the railway could compel sales. Daniel explained eminent domain honestly, including its limits, and told them that the railway preferred willing sellers at negotiated prices and that landowners who held together would have significantly more negotiating leverage than those who sold individually under pressure. Jerome Fitch asked 3 questions that were tangentially related to the railway and primarily about American history, which Letitia fielded with patient skill. At the end of the meeting, Sheriff Pratt stood up and said that he had verified Daniel Whitaker's credentials with the railway company that afternoon by telegraph, and that Mr. Whitaker's account of his survey work was confirmed. He said that the claims being circulated about the school's funding being at risk were not confirmed by the territorial board's records, which he had also verified by telegraph. He said that residents should be cautious about any offers made without independent legal advice. He said this clearly and without drama, and the room received it with the solid satisfaction of a community that has been given real information by people it trusts. Weston Carr left Caldera Springs on a Sunday morning 2 weeks later. He had made no purchases. He had found that the valley was, for his purposes, impenetrably organized, and there were other valleys that were not. He left without ceremony or confrontation, which was the right outcome. The real threats in life, Daniel had long believed, were rarely resolved by confrontation. They were resolved by the steadier and more durable work of community. The railway's official announcement came in August. The spur through Caldera Springs was confirmed. The valley land tripled in assessed value within 6 months. Edmund Ridley paid off his bank loan in 2 years, but all of that came later. In the summer of 1883, what happened was simpler and larger than land values and railway spurs. On a Sunday in July, Daniel asked Letitia to walk with him up the hill above the schoolhouse, to the meadow where in the spring the wildflowers had come up in their dozens. The meadow was in its summer phase now, the early flowers gone, the grasses tall and dry and gold in the afternoon light, but there were still things blooming in the shaded edges near the tree line, and she found and named them as they walked. 4 species she added to the list she was keeping for the students to compare against the spring list in the following year. They sat on a flat rock at the top of the meadow with the whole valley spread below them, the ranches and the town and the silver thread of the creek and the distant blue line of the mountains to the north. And Daniel took out of his coat pocket a ring that he had ordered from a jeweler in Pinyon Creek 6 weeks earlier and had been carrying since its arrival, waiting for the right moment, which he had concluded did not exist in any predetermined form and would simply have to be created. "Letitia," he said. She looked at the ring in his hand, and then at his face, and the expression on her face was one he had never seen before, open and soft and very bright. "I am not going to make a long speech," he said, because that was true, and because she was the kind of woman who would appreciate the honesty of it. "I am going to ask you simply whether you will marry me. And I want you to know that I am asking because you are the most remarkable person I have ever known, and because my life is better in every measurable dimension for having you in it, and because I believe we are very well suited, and because I love you with a completeness I did not know was possible before this spring." She looked at the ring and then at the valley and then at him, and her eyes were bright in a way that was not quite tears and not quite not tears, and she said, "Yes. Of course, yes." He put the ring on her finger. It was a small gold band with a single garnet, dark red as the prickly poppies on the Las Cruces road, and she looked at it for a long moment and said, "Thomas would have been insufferable about this. He would have said he told you so." "He would have been right," Daniel said. She laughed, and he kissed her, and the valley stretched out below them in the summer light, and the meadowlark called from somewhere in the gold grass, and it was the kind of moment that does not need to be improved by anything. They were married in October, exactly 1 year after Daniel had bought the abandoned schoolhouse. Reverend Cobb from Pinyon Creek performed the ceremony in the schoolhouse itself, which was Letitia's choice, and which everyone in Caldera Springs agreed was exactly right. The children decorated the benches with dried flowers. Maybelle Hooper made a wedding cake using a recipe she described as her grandmother's and which was, by general agreement, the best thing she had ever baked. Rafael Garcia and his family provided music, his eldest son playing the fiddle, and the schoolroom that Daniel had built board by board in the cold autumn before his life changed, filled with light and people, and the particular warmth of a community celebrating something it considers its own. Rosa Garcia was the flower girl and took the responsibility with enormous seriousness. Caleb Ridley, now 15 and significantly less skeptical about most things than he had been in March, stood up very straight in the borrowed coat he had outgrown and served as a kind of informal usher, which no one had assigned him but which he had apparently decided was needed. Doc Hartley's daughter Miriam cried, which surprised her and delighted Letitia, who had not realized until that moment how deeply she had become attached to all 12 of these children. Jerome Fitch made a speech that was longer than strictly necessary and contained 3 historical tangents, all of which were interesting, and concluded that Daniel Whitaker had turned out to be exactly what Caldera Springs needed and that Letitia Keene was not the worst teacher the valley had ever had, which from Jerome Fitch was a comprehensive endorsement. Sheriff Pratt shook Daniel's hand and said, "You did right by this town," which was, in Pratt's vocabulary, the highest possible praise. Daniel stood at the front of the schoolhouse next to Letitia in the morning light, and felt the particular quality of happiness that is different from any single moment of joy, deeper and steadier and aware of itself, in a way that moments of joy are not. And he thought about the cold trail and the coffee and a man who had talked for 6 hours about his sister and had said, "Find Daniel Whitaker. He will make sure you are all right." He had not made sure she was all right, he thought. She had made herself all right by the sheer force of her own will and intelligence and courage. What they had done together was different. They had made each other better, more complete, more fully themselves than either had been alone. That, he thought, was what Thomas had perhaps known or hoped or simply trusted to the trail and to chance. Letitia turned and looked at him with the full direct honesty that was her particular gift and said quietly, before the ceremony began, "I am not afraid of this." "I know," he said. "I want you to know that I mean it. I'm not marrying you because you built the school or because Thomas trusted you or because it is what people expect. I am marrying you because you are the person I want to build my life with." "I know that too," he said. "I want the same thing." She held his gaze for a moment, and then the reverend began, and the ceremony carried them forward into the rest of their lives. The school continued through the winter of 1883 and into 1884 with 7 new students added to the roll, 2 from the family of the new railway surveying crew's foreman, who had moved his family to Caldera Springs in anticipation of the construction work, and 5 from 3 homesteading families who had settled in the valley that autumn, drawn by the news of the railway and by the word that had spread, as word in the West does, about a valley with good soil and a good school. Letitia taught them all. She expanded her curriculum as the school grew. She wrote to the territorial board requesting an advanced reader series and an arithmetic text for the older students, and received them by April. She wrote a letter to the Santa Fe newspaper describing the value of small frontier schools, which was printed in full and drew several congratulatory letters from teachers across the territory, and one very pointed critique from a gentleman in Albuquerque who disagreed with her methods, to which she wrote a careful, comprehensive, and utterly devastating reply that Daniel read 3 times and considered one of the finest pieces of argumentation he had ever encountered. He had finished the irrigation survey for the Garcia Ranch by November and had begun a second survey for the railway itself, the preliminary engineering work for the spur construction, which kept him in the valley and brought in enough income to be comfortable. He bought a small piece of land on the eastern edge of the valley from old Jerome Fitch, who was selling parcels as he simplified his life, and began building a house. He built it the way he had built the schoolhouse, carefully, with good materials, with attention to what it would need to be rather than just what it was currently. He built it with a study that had east-facing windows for morning light, because Letitia did her best thinking in morning light. He built it with a kitchen large enough for 2 people to work in without frustrating each other, because he had learned to cook, and she had learned to cook things more complicated than beans and cornbread, and they had discovered that cooking together in the evenings was one of the specific pleasures of their life that neither had anticipated. He built the bookshelves before the bedroom furniture, which Maybelle Hooper found deeply illustrative of something, though she was not sure what. He built a room at the back that could be a storage room or a nursery, depending on what the future required, and he did not mention this calculation to anyone except Letitia, who noted it and said nothing but put her hand on the doorframe one evening while they were walking through the nearly finished house, and left it there for a moment with an expression of private and certain happiness. They moved into the house in March of 1884, 1 year after Letitia had arrived on the stagecoach with her battered trunk. The trunk now lived under the bed in the main bedroom, its contents distributed through the shelves and drawers and windowsills of the house, the Wildflower Journal from 1864 on the study bookshelf, Thomas's pressed prickly poppy, carefully mounted and framed, on the wall above the study desk, the primer books and the teaching materials and the letters from students' parents, in the kitchen where Letitia sorted her school papers. The daguerreotype, which Daniel had kept for 2 years in his breast pocket, on the mantelpiece above the fireplace in the main room, where it would be seen every day. They had talked about Thomas often, in the months since Letitia's arrival. Not always with grief, or not only with grief. They had told each other the stories they each had of him, building between them a portrait that was more complete than either had possessed alone. Thomas who was funny, Thomas who was principled to a fault, Thomas who had known Daniel Whitaker for less than 2 years and had trusted him completely and had been right too. Thomas who had loved his sister more than anyone in the world and had sent her in the end, not a letter of farewell but a direction, a compass bearing toward a future he hoped would be good. Letitia had cried once telling a story she had not told before, a memory of Thomas as a boy teaching her to read before she could go to school, his finger moving under the words with infinite patience, his voice perfectly certain that she could do it because she was smart, and because reading was not hard, it just required someone to show you the key. She had cried and Daniel had held her and said nothing, because there was nothing to say, just the truth of the loss and the truth of the love that outlasted it. In the autumn of 1884, Letitia told Daniel she was expecting their first child. She told him in the study, on a Thursday evening, while he was working on engineering drawings and she was grading compositions. She set down her pen and said his name in the particular tone she used when she had something important to say, and he looked up, and she told him, and he crossed the room in 3 steps and held her face in his hands and looked at her with an expression that she later described to Mabel Hooper, with some difficulty, as the most purely joyful thing she had ever seen on a human face. "Are you well?" he asked. "Is everything are you?" "I am perfectly fine," she said, which was mostly true. The mornings were not delightful but were manageable. Doc Hartley confirmed it. Early June. He held her for a long time without speaking, which was unlike him. He was generally a person with words, but the words, she understood, had simply been superseded by the fact of it. The pregnancy was uncomplicated, which Doc Hartley confirmed at regular intervals with the careful optimism of a frontier physician who had seen enough to know that uncomplicated was not guaranteed and was grateful for it when it arrived. Letitia taught through December and into the new year, adapting her methods slightly as her energy changed but not stopping, not because she felt she had to prove something, but because the work mattered and she was good at it, and the children's education did not pause for anything other than absolute necessity. She hired a girl from the Garcia family, 16-year-old Francisca, to help with the school in the afternoons from February onward, partly for practical reasons, and partly because Francisca had expressed a clear interest in teaching, and this was the best possible training Letitia could give her. The baby was born on the 3rd day of June, 1885, in the bedroom of the house Daniel had built, with Doc Hartley attending and Daniel present, which was not the universal custom but was emphatically what both of them wanted. It was a long night and a hard morning, and at 8:30 in the June morning, a boy arrived in the world with his father's stubborn jaw and his mother's dark eyes, and the full-throated announcement of good lungs. Daniel looked at his son and felt what parents always feel, that specific vertigo of love that arrives instantaneously and completely and does not diminish, and held him for a long time while Letitia rested and watched them both with an expression of exhausted, absolute contentment. "Thomas," Daniel said quietly. Letitia looked at him across the room. He had not discussed the name with her beforehand, which was perhaps irregular, but she had the feeling he had known it for some time and had simply been waiting for the right moment. "Thomas," she said. "Yes." Thomas Daniel Whitaker was a child of the valley from his first hour. He grew up in the house with the east-facing windows and the bookshelves full of primers and the daguerreotype on the mantelpiece, and he grew up knowing who the young man in the photograph was and why his name was carried forward. And the story of the cold trail and the coffee and the promise was one of the first long stories he heard, and he asked for it to be told again, and again, in the way that children ask for the stories that make them feel rooted. The railway spur reached Caldera Springs in 1886, 3 years after the announcement, which was approximately on schedule for a railway project of that era. The construction brought money and people and disruption in the measures that railway construction always did, and the valley changed, as all places change when connection to the wider world increases. But the school remained, and the school was what Daniel had hoped it would be from the beginning, the anchor of the community through all the changes that came. The territorial board expanded the funding as the student population grew. Letitia trained 2 more local women as teaching assistants over the following years, Francisca Garcia being the first, who was a natural teacher, and eventually took over the younger students' instruction while Letitia focused on the older ones. The irrigation channels Daniel had surveyed and engineered were built in the years 1884 through 1886, improving the productivity of 3 ranches and enabling 2 homesteaders to farm land that had previously been too dry for reliable crops. The work was not dramatic. It was the steady, practical work of making a community function better, and it suited Daniel completely. They had a second child in the spring of 1887, a daughter they named Clara, after Letitia's mother. Clara arrived with her mother's intensity and her father's patience, a combination that proved over the years to be formidably effective. She sat in the front row of her mother's school from the age of 5, and had read every book on the study shelves by the time she was 10. And when she was 12, she argued with her mother about the teaching of history, with a precision and passion that Letitia found both deeply familiar and profoundly satisfying, which was the particular pleasure of having a child who has learned your own best qualities and is using them on you. The house on the eastern edge of the valley had grown by then, the back room having become exactly the nursery Daniel had silently planned for, and then expanding further as the family required, with a room added for the children when Thomas outgrew the crib and Clara required space of her own, and a wider porch added in 1888 that faced the valley and the mountains, and where, in the evenings, the family gathered after supper in the long summer light. Daniel sat on the porch on an evening in September of 1888 with the particular settled quality of a man who has made all the decisions that mattered and made them right. Not perfectly, not without error, but right in the fundamental directions, the directions of value and love and purpose, and who has arrived at a point in his life where looking forward and looking back produce the same sensation: gratitude. Thomas, age 3, was asleep inside. Clara, 15 months and very determined about mobility, had finally been put to sleep after considerable negotiation. The valley was blue and gold in the autumn evening, the cattle moving on the Ridley pasture below, smoke from the Garcia kitchen rising straight into the calm air, the school building on the hill above the town, catching the last of the light on its newly painted walls, white now, repainted that summer because Daniel had repainted it every 2 years since he first opened its door. Letitia came out and sat beside him with 2 cups of coffee, the good Arbocle's kind, and gave him one without comment because she never needed to comment on it. It was simply what she did, and settled into the chair next to his and looked out at the valley with the same expression he felt on his own face, that deep and particular contentment. "The board has offered me a district supervisor position," she said. He looked at her. This was the first he had heard of it. "They want someone to oversee teacher training and placement for the eastern districts. I could do most of it by correspondence. I would need to travel to Santa Fe twice a year." She turned and looked at him. "I want to hear what you think." "I think," he said, "that you have been building towards something like this for years without calling it that, and I think you would be the best possible person for it. It would mean more responsibility, more time taken from teaching directly. Francisca Garcia is a fully capable teacher," he said. "The school will be in excellent hands when you travel." She nodded, looking back at the valley. "I keep thinking about how many children are in schools like this one used to be. empty or worse, inadequate, with teachers who are not supported or trained. Then fix it, he said simply. She turned and looked at him again, and he saw that same expression he had seen on the rock above the meadow on the day he proposed, open and soft and very bright. "You are the most straightforwardly encouraging person I have ever known," she said. "You do not need encouragement," he said. "You need someone to confirm what you already know. You have already decided." She laughed. "Yes, I have already decided." She leaned and rested her head briefly against his shoulder, which was an easy and comfortable thing, the gesture of a woman entirely at home in the proximity of the person beside her. "I accepted this morning." He put his arm around her, and they sat in the September evening with the valley below them and the school on the hill above them and the children sleeping inside, and the meadowlark called from somewhere in the autumn grass. It called as it had called on the day they had sat on the schoolhouse steps in the first spring, as it had called through every season since, patient and continuous, the valley's own particular music. "I have been thinking about Thomas," Letitia said. Not with sadness, not exactly. With the tone she had developed for speaking about him. The one that held grief and love and gratitude all at once in a way that honored all three without letting any one of them dominate. "What about him?" "About the letter, the last one where he asked me to find you." She paused. "I have been thinking that what he actually did was see something, before I did, before you did perhaps, or at least before you had admitted it." She looked out at the valley. "He trusted you completely, but he also trusted me. And I think what he really wrote in that letter underneath the words was, 'This man is the kind of person you need, not to be rescued by, not to take care of you. The kind of person who is worth knowing for who he is.'" Daniel was quiet for a moment. He was a remarkably perceptive person. "Was insufferable about it," she said, with the particular warmth that was her way of loving the fact of Thomas, the whole fact of him, including all the ways she missed him and all the ways he had exasperated her and all the ways she had loved him. "He was," Daniel agreed. "He would have adored you," she said. "He would have found reasons to take credit for everything. He would have been right to." She lifted her head and looked at him. "You give him too much." "I give him what is accurate," Daniel said. "He was the beginning of it, the trail, the conversation, the photograph." He paused. "I have been grateful to him every day since." She was quiet. The valley darkened slowly around them. The first star appeared above the northern mountains. "So have I," she said finally. They sat together in the full evening, the coffee growing cold between their hands, the valley going dark and then silver under the rising moon. And inside the house, their children slept in the rooms their father had built before they were imagined. And the books waited on their shelves. And the daguerreotype watched from the mantelpiece with the flat gray patience of photographs, which do not age and do not change and do not leave. Below in the town, the schoolhouse stood white on the hill, its windows dark, its door latched against the night. It had been a great mystery once, that building, the question every person in Caldera Springs had carried through an autumn and a winter. Why had a solitary man paid cash money for a worthless abandoned school and spent 4 months rebuilding it in silence? The answer had arrived in the spring, as answers to the best questions do, not with a single explanation but with a person, full and real and more than any answer. And the answer had become a marriage and a family and a community and a life that neither of them had planned and both of them had needed. In the morning, the meadowlark would call again. The school would open. The children would come up the hill with their slate boards and their primer books and their faces young and ready. The way faces are when there is someone worth learning from waiting at the front of the room. And the valley would hold them all in its blue and golden light, and the mountains would hold the valley, and the years would hold the mountains, and it would all be, in every possible way that mattered, exactly enough. Thomas Whitaker grew up to be a surveyor like his father, with his mother's sharp capacity for argument and his uncle's eye for the useful truth in the landscape. He married a schoolteacher from Silver City at the age of 26, a woman with her own opinions and her own work and her own life, and brought her to the valley to meet his parents, and she and Letitia got along so immediately, and so well that Daniel and Thomas exchanged a single look of relieved and slightly awed comprehension. Caldera Whitaker became a physician, the first woman physician in the territory's Eastern District, a fact that outraged several people and inspired considerably more, including Doc Hartley's daughter Miriam, now grown and a nurse, who had known Caldera since childhood and had been expecting something approximately this remarkable from her for 20 years. Letitia Whitaker, née Keene, served as the Territorial Board Supervisor of Teacher Training and Placement for 11 years, beginning in 1888, and in that time placed and trained 47 teachers in frontier schools across 4 districts, and established a teacher correspondence course that reached women in communities without any other access to professional training. The program was named, in 1902, the Keene-Whitaker Teacher Training Correspondence, which she found both gratifying and slightly embarrassing, and which Daniel found entirely appropriate. Daniel Whitaker surveyed and engineered infrastructure across 3 territories for 30 years, his reputation growing steadily through the quality of the work and the consistency of his character, and in 1900 was appointed to the board of the Territorial Bureau of Public Works, where he served until New Mexico became a state in 1912 and the structure changed. He retired to the house on the eastern edge of the valley in 1910, still sound, still rising before the sun, still finding reasons to be useful. They grew old in the valley, the 2 of them in the house he had built and she had filled, and the view from the eastern porch did not change in any essential way through all the decades. The mountains still blue in the morning and gold in the evening, the school still white on the hill, the creek still silver in the summer, the meadowlark still calling from the grass. They grew old knowing what they had built together, which was more than a house and more than a career and more than a family, though it was all of those things. They had built a life that was true to itself from the beginning, that had started in honesty, in grief shared honestly, in love spoken plainly without ornament, and that had remained honest through everything that came, the difficulties and the changes and the losses that come to every life. On an evening in the autumn of their 40th year together, sitting on the porch in the September light, Daniel took Letitia's hand in the particular way he had, the way that was not the tender gesture of new love, but the grip of a man who has held the same hand for 40 years and feels the weight of every one of those years in it with gratitude. And she leaned against his shoulder as she always had, as easy and comfortable as breathing, and the valley spread below them in the last of the light. Thomas would have been 61 this year, she said. He would have been the most difficult person at every Thanksgiving table in the territory, Daniel said. She laughed. It was the same laugh still, the real one, the surprised one, the one that transformed her face completely. He had spent 40 years making that happen. He had not run out of ways. He would have been, she agreed. The evening settled around them. The school on the hill caught the last light on its white walls. Below in the town, a lamp came on in the window of Maybelle Hooper's dry goods store, now run by Maybelle's granddaughter, who had her grandmother's talent for flower-covered aprons and irrepressible curiosity. The Garcia Ranch sent up its dinner smoke as it had for 50 years. The creek caught the moon. The meadowlark, impossibly, still sang from somewhere in the autumn grass. They sat together in the full evening and the full life of it, and there was nothing left unfinished between them, nothing held back or unspoken, nothing that needed resolving. There was only this: the valley, the mountains, the house he had built, the school she had filled, the children they had raised, the work they had done, the love they had spoken plainly from the first moment it was true, and had kept on speaking every day since, in every possible language available to 2 people who have chosen each other completely. And the meadowlark sang, and the stars came out over the mountains, and the valley held them in its ancient and indifferent and entirely perfect light,